And just a few prefatory comments. By the early 1700s, the Chesapeake region of colonial North America, colonial British North America, had developed a slave-based economy. And most of you, I'm sure, know that tobacco was the primary cash crop. In the early to middle 1600s, most tobacco planters used indentured servants to grow this very labor-intensive crop. However, by the middle of the 1600s, that supply of indentured servants from England was beginning to diminish. Many folks, I think, over in England found out that coming to colonial Virginia or Maryland was not really the best thing to do for one's health. The mortality rate was almost dreadful in the colonial Chesapeake, and I think word of that got back to England. In addition, the English economy was improving, and folks were less inclined to leave the country to take a risk of trying to grow tobacco in the Chesapeake. So by the mid-1600s, there was a shift from indentured servant labor to slave labor. Of course, in British America, the Caribbean, the sugar plantations, the very brutal sugar plantations down in the Caribbean were already destroying the lives of countless numbers of slaves. So slave labor came up to North America, to the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake and the rice plantations in time down in Carolina. So we can be absolutely sure that Cuff Frisby's ancestors endured this brutal Middle Passage, as it was known, from Africa to North America. Cuff Frisby's maternal ancestors first arrived in St. Mary's County in the early 18th century of the 1700s. We know that by 1737, a Nicholas Sewall, S-E-W-A-L-L, was a prominent planter and also a member of the colonial Maryland legislature, died that year, leaving 37 slaves, including 3 women. And Linda, maybe you could go ahead and put that handout up on the screen now. Okay, there we go. But these 3 women were named Phyllis, Monica, and Jenny. All of them were born about 1707. The probate inventories give us approximate ages for the slaves who were owned by the testator. One of these women was likely the mother of another Phyllis, who was born around 1731, once again based on the ages in Nicholas Sewall's probate inventory. After Sewall's death, his daughter Elizabeth inherited the younger Phyllis. She married a James Frisby, who was a wealthy tobacco planter from Cecil County. James Frisby, also from a prominent family some of whose relatives served in the assembly, which met in Annapolis, of course. Now, there were a lot of connections across Maryland from the northern end up in Cecil County down to St. Mary's. So Elizabeth married James Frisby, and Elizabeth moved with her husband up to Cecil County. In 1761, the Maryland Historical Society has a tax list of Cecil County, which has survived something like 250 years now. And that tax list lists Phyllis as one of the 24 slaves owned by James Frisby. Of course, by the laws of those days, when a woman married, her property by law and by definition became the property of her husband. So when James Frisby died around 1775, his widow Sarah, who was presumably his second wife, was given the prerogative in James Frisby's will to choose 12 slaves of her own. Sarah Frisby chose 12 who were Phyllis herself and 12 or 11 of her descendants, one of whom was named Cuff. We'll return to that in a couple of minutes. But Sarah Frisby specifically stated in the documents which survived from those days that she wanted to keep families together. And needless to say, when a slave owner passed away, the estate was often divided, and slave families were often sundered apart, separated by a death. But Sarah Frisby evidently had at least some measure of humanity, and specifically stated that she wanted Phyllis and her family, her children and grandchildren, to remain together. So Cuff was one of Phyllis's grandchildren. Now, what we don't know is the identity of Cuff's father. What we do know, however, is that James Frisby's daughter, Sarah, married someone from Newcastle County, Benjamin Noxon, who was the son of the noted surveyor, Thomas Noxon, who had died back in 1743. What we also know is that when Thomas Noxon died in 1743, among his sizable number of slaves were a husband and a wife, so identified in the probate inventory, Cuff and Moll. So my hypothesis is, I can't prove it, but I think it's a reasonable assumption, is that Phyllis, the slave of the Frisby family, might well have married a son of Cuff and Moll, the slaves of Thomas Noxon. Further extrapolating from that, I suggest that Phyllis was Cuff Frisby's grandmother. Joe, the son of the Noxon slaves, was his father. Now, Cuff Frisby was born around 1770. His name was not in that tax assessment in 1761, but he was mentioned as one of Phyllis's descendants when James Frisby died in 1775. And in spite of her humanity and keeping the family together, Phyllis, like most slave owners, was quite willing to exploit the labor of her slaves. 1780, Phyllis hired out, as the term was, 5 of her slaves. May I ask someone to mute, please?
Common side effects include inflammation of the nose and throat, insomnia, and sleepiness. Don't take Austedo if you have liver problems or taking this.
Sarah hired out 5 of her slaves: Ben, Cuff, Stephen, Betty, and Kate, to Richard Savin, who was another fairly wealthy Cecil County planner. So 1780, once again, Sarah Frisby hired out 5 slaves, Cuff included. And Cuff at the time, based on my estimated birth date of 1770, was about only 10 years old when he was hired out to work for this Richard Savin. However, Sarah Frisby was on the move again in 1794. She decided to move from Maryland to the newly developing community of Middletown, Delaware. By the way, I'm doing some research on the development of Middletown, which I hope to present to you in a future meeting, but that's still somewhat of a work in progress. The lease of the 5 slaves to Richard Savin became an issue because it was supposed to expire after 14 years in 1794. However, by this time, Sarah Frisby had moved to Delaware, and if you wanted to transport slaves across the state line from Maryland or any other state into Delaware, it required an act of the General Assembly. So in January of 1794, Sarah Frisby petitioned the Delaware General Assembly, asking for permission to transport these 5 slaves, including Cuff, from Maryland into Delaware. In this petition, she stated that the transport would render the condition of the slaves more comfortable to them and more profitable to herself. More comfortable to them and more profitable to herself. I expect the profitable to herself motive might have been higher in her mind. The General Assembly did pass the legislation, and Sarah Frisby did bring the slaves into Delaware. Now, the records are not totally clear after this, but we can assume, just by other circumstances, that at some point before 1802, Sarah freed her slave Cuff, along with Cuff's mother, Phyllis, who was still living. By this time, she was pushing 70 years old, which was, given the way slaves were literally worked to death sometimes, Phyllis had a strong constitution, but she was still alive in 1802. Sarah Frisby herself died in 1802. She still owned 10 slaves, including 3 of those who had been transported by permission of the General Assembly of Delaware. Sarah Frisby's will provided for the emancipation of those slaves, males at 29 years of age, the females at 25. And when we look at emancipations by will, or we look at the emancipations recorded in the deed books, that's often the way it happened. Slaves would be required to serve to a certain age, usually in the 20s, usually a slightly longer term for male slaves over female slaves, but they were often set free at some point in their 20s. As a free man, Cuff Frisby adopted a surname, and he adopted the surname of his previous owner. Now, for years, there was the thinking that slaves always adopted the surname of their former owner. Well, I've done enough research to know that this is decidedly not the case. The slaves often asserted their independence, asserted their freedom by adopting a different surname. But for reasons of his own, Cuff adopted the surname Frisby, perhaps something that Sarah Frisby had done for him. Well, we just will never know for sure. But at the same time, we must emphasize that Delaware law very strictly limited the rights of free slaves. Indeed, historian William H. Williams, who wrote a wonderful book on slavery and freedom in Delaware, published back in the 1980s, referred to the type of liberty that free blacks had in Delaware as sort of a mongrel liberty, one that was very severely restricted. Free blacks could own property, they could initiate lawsuits, but they were denied rights such as holding public office, voting, or jury service. Census takers also documented the freedom of Phyllis and her son Cuff. In 1800, we know that Phyllis, a free black woman, lived in Middletown. So we know that the family had come to Middletown by 1800 with 4 folks in her household. Cuff Frisby's name first appeared in the tax assessments for St. George's 100, in which Middletown is located, by 1807, paying what was in the tax records known as the rate of the person, essentially a poll tax. It was called a poll tax, even though Cuff Frisby, like other free blacks, could not vote. By 1810, Cuff Frisby had established a household of his own, a household with 6 members. And the 1810 census, as well as the 1800 census before it, only lists the total number of folks who lived in a black household. It does not break it down by age, and the census records do not list the names of every household member until 1850. So if you're doing genealogical research, that's a good thing to keep in mind. Cuff Frisby also appeared in the 1820 census. At this point, I don't expect you to memorize these numbers, but his household included 2 males under 14, 1 male between 14 and 25, and 1 over 45. 3 females resided in that household, 2 under 14 and 1 over 45. two older ones, of course, being Cuff and his wife, Mary. And it might be a good point to pause now and just discuss why so many slaves were set free in Delaware in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We know that in 1790, the majority of Blacks who lived in Delaware were enslaved. By 1800, the majority were free. And indeed, by 1860, only 5 years before slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, something like 90% of the Blacks who lived in Delaware were free, only 10% remaining in bondage. But again, it was that very limited, very constricted liberty that Bill Williams discussed in his book. But why did this happen? Several reasons. One, religious reasons. We know that in Delaware, many Quakers set their slaves free. The Quaker yearly meeting in Philadelphia had mandated that Quakers free their slaves if they wanted to remain a Quaker in good standing. This happened in 1776, ironically, the same year that the United States declared independence. The Philadelphia yearly Quaker meeting mandated that Quakers free their slaves. Another factor that motivated some folks was the rhetoric of the Revolutionary era itself. The belief that all humans had certain natural rights, and the obvious incompatibility with slavery with such rhetoric did lead some slave owners to see the wrongfulness of holding their fellow human beings in bondage. There were also economic factors as well. The upper eastern shore of Maryland, indeed parts of Delaware as well, were shifting away from growing tobacco to growing grains. Growing grains is much less labor intensive than growing tobacco. So many slaveholders freed their slaves because, well, they simply didn't need slave labor anymore, growing a much less labor intensive crop. Now, Sarah Frisby did not state her motivation for freeing Cuff and her other slaves. Returning to the life of Cuff Frisby, he married, perhaps even before gaining his freedom. We know his wife was named Mary, and my guess is, and again, this is not documented proof, but it's a reasonable guess, I believe, on my part, that Mary was previously enslaved by the Reynolds family, who also lived in the vicinity of Middletown. There are a variety of documents that reveal connections between the Reynolds and the Frisby families. Mary Frisby might have been the daughter of a Sally and the granddaughter of a very old, described in the probate inventory, Andrew, both who were listed as slaves in the estate inventory of Richard Reynolds, who died in 1779. Indeed, Cuff and Mary Frisby named one of their sons Andrew. Another thing I've learned in my research is that cross-generational naming was very widely employed by former slaves. And there are further connections with the Reynolds family as well. For example, on February 26, 1814, and I don't expect you to memorize that date, Thomas and Mary Reynolds sold a lot in Middletown to Cuff Frisby. For the first time, he was able to buy property of his own. 4 years later, a widow who lived in Middletown, Mary Scott, sold another lot to Cuff Frisby. Now, in 1825, Cuff and Mary Frisby sold one of those lots to a chap named Peter Curley. But Cuff Frisby's acquisition of a small lot, a small property of his own, was noted in the tax records of St. George's Hundred by 1817. In 1837, when the tax records became a little more in-depth, a little more thorough, they noted that Cuff Frisby had a frame house on that property. But the tax records of 1816 and these have, by the way, been published, reveal yet another connection between the Reynolds and the Frisby families. Cuff and Mary Frisby's son, Andrew, married a woman named Araminta, or Minty as she's sometimes known in extant records. And in 1816, tax assessors identified a slave woman named Minty, a slave for life, as she was described in the tax records, owned by John Reynolds. Now, slaves identified as slaves for life in tax records did not always serve for life. So I think that's very likely that that's what happened to Araminta or Minty when she married Andrew Frisby. But what we do know is that the Reynolds family did have a fairly close connection with Cuff Frisby. They had sold him property, showed him some consideration, perhaps even some respect in selling this property. So the next portion of my paper moves to how did Cuff Frisby and his family earn a living? How did they make their way as free people? Well, he had to perform a variety of tasks. My guess is that he had no steady employment, no steady job. And my guess, well, not only my guess, but my assumption based on the records I researched is that he was a day laborer. The account books of a storekeeper named Alton Davis are in the library up at the Winterthur Museum. And Alton Davis was a merchant in Cantwell's Bridge or Odessa up to about 1809. In 1809, he moved his store to Middletown. And after 1809, his records include a number of transactions with folks who lived in Middletown. And we do know from these records that Alton Davis employed Cuff Frisby on more than one occasion. For example, on February 22nd, 1810, Davis paid Frisby 13 shillings and 7.5 pence. And even after many folks had moved to the dollar, Frisby was still keeping his records in pounds, shillings, and pence. But 13 shillings, 7.5 pence, the balance of cleaning out a well. 6 days later, February 28th, Davis paid Frisby 3 shillings and 9 pence for 1 day's labor, beating and mowing corn. And this happened on several occasions after that. Frisby would work a day or two for Davis and receive this daily wage of 3 shillings, 9.5 pence. Now you might well be wondering, how much is 3 shillings and 9.5 pence? The exchange rate between the English currency used in Delaware and the dollar was $2.66 to a pound. And if my calculations are correct, 3 shillings and 9 pence would come out to 47 cents. So Cuff Frisby earned 47 cents a day. What that is in 2021 dollars, I'm not quite sure. In addition, Cuff Frisby was an occasional customer at Davis's store. After Davis moved his business to Middletown in 1809, Davis store records include purchase of a number of items, stuff like sugar, eggs, other kinds of foodstuffs. One that intrigued me was on January 20th, 1810, Cuff Frisby purchased a pair of mittens for 2 shillings, 9.5 pence. Very appropriate thing to purchase in a January, I suppose, but think of it, the 2 shillings, 9.5 pence Frisby paid for those mittens was about 2/3 of his day's wages. In addition, Davis sold different types of cloth, muslin, linen, and so forth to the Frisby family. Mary Frisby evidently made the clothes that Cuff, Mary, and their children had to wear. In addition to his day labor, Cuff Frisby supplemented his very uncertain income with other types of odd jobs. For example, we know that he was a grave digger for St. Anne's Parish, just south of Middletown. I've looked at probate inventories of folks, including those in the Reynolds family. On at least 5 occasions, Cuff Frisby was paid something like $2 for digging the graves for Thomas Reynolds and several other people, which led me to wonder if Cuff Frisby did not serve as a sexton for the St. Anne's Church. I don't know if St. Anne's has any such records that would document that, but he did dig graves in the St. Anne's burial ground on a number of occasions, and interesting point to research if the documents are there. We also know that Cuff Frisby worked on the road. And the way things worked, the way road construction, road maintenance worked back then was that folks would more or less be conscripted. If you couldn't afford to pay a tax on the roads, your services would be conscripted to either build or maintain roads. And not all of these road records have survived, but I found records for at least 5 years in which Cuff Frisby was paid small amounts of money for performing maintenance or new construction on roads in St. George's Hundred. I already pointed out that tax assessors by 1837 made note of Cuff Frisby's rather modest, surely rather modest frame dwelling. And we also know that Cuff Frisby provided for his family by oftentimes purchasing items from estate sales. When various folks died, Cuff Frisby was often at the estate sales and would buy kitchen utensils, items such as bacon, a couple of young pigs on one occasion, just looking for items that he could use to support his family. Cuff Frisby died in 1845. His probate records are among the many such records down at the archives in Dover. The appraisers of his estate valued that estate at $21.87.5. Of course, $21.87.5 was worth a lot more in 1845 than it is in 2021, but having looked at those records, his estate only included the most basic of household goods. Richard Lockwood, who was a wealthy local landowner, administered Frisby's estate, and he also sold Frisby's lot of land in Middletown to Henry D. Huffaker for a lot of land sold for $136.65. So coming to our conclusions, Cuff Frisby was obviously nowhere close to being a wealthy man, but he was likely better off than most Black people were in lower Newcastle County. Research of the tax record shows us that probably less than 10% of the Black population in Delaware actually owned property, and Cuff Frisby was one of that less than 10%. Cuff Frisby also employed the family connections with members of the white community in and around Middletown to advance his own purposes, establishing connections with his previous owner, Sarah Frisby, and the Frisby family, for example, establishing those connections with the Reynolds family. But to sum up, he literally had to eke out a living. Day labor, for example, such as what he performed for Alton Davis, odd jobs such as digging graves in St. Anne's burial ground. Now, without such sources of income, Cuff Frisby would have had even more difficult circumstances than he did. But Cuff Frisby's life certainly provides a clear example of the difficulties confronting the African American community in southern Newcastle County. So, are there any questions?
Don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask a question.
I don't
Bruce,
know. I have a comment. I'm just curious. His descendants, is Mr. Frisby, the school teacher, one of them?
I don't know. The fellow I was doing research for lives up in the Philadelphia vicinity, and he sent me only his own family line. He is, I think it was Cuff Frisby's son or grandson, moved up to Philadelphia and has been up there, well, ever since.
Okay.
So I haven't researched any of the other descendants.
Okay.
Frank Frisby, I remember Frank Frisby.
Yeah, Bruce, I have a question. What have you heard as the possible reason that a lot of people would free their slaves upon their death? I mean, was there any kind of, was it just wanting to get into heaven, or was it, was there some financial advantage or what? Because I've read various things and I don't know what's right.
Well, if you've read various things, that's because there probably were various things. The main point is that there were some people who thought they could earn their eternal standing by freeing slaves. That's quite a possibility that people were thinking in that direction. The other possibility is they maybe saw it as an easy way out. Rather than dealing with freeing slaves in their own lifetime, they just put it off till they had passed away and let their children, their executors, deal with the issue.
Yeah, it seems to me as though they were thinking about their own interests. They wouldn't let them go, but when they died, then they knew they were wrong having slaves, but they couldn't let them go until they died. So I think living their life, they knew they were wrong.
Well,
I think you have an excellent point there.
What I read someplace, and I'll have to look it up again, is that if you wanted to free a slave during your lifetime, you had to put up money to the state in case that freed slave became a burden on the state.
That's right. You did have to post a bond.
But I'm not sure whether you had to do, I mean, whether your estate had to do that if they were freed by your will. I just don't know. I'll have to do some more research. Oh, and then when you were talking about St. Anne's, and I ran and got my St. Anne's book that has it's terrific, by Dorothy Colburn, and in the back in the appendix, then there are 4 Frisbys listed as members. These are all free blacks. 2 free blacks and one just says blacks, and they were members. They became members in the 1840s and 50s. So at least some of the ones, I presume it's his descendants or some relatives of Cuff's, stayed around, and yeah, there's a Frank, a John M, Mary Eliza, and Rachel. So
Thank you.
So anyway, that's at the back of Dottie Colburn's book.
Yeah, I have her book myself, so I'll have to look that up. But
Yeah,
I think
So
it's safe
anyway.
to say that they were Cuff's descendants, maybe directly, or perhaps nephews, or a relationship like
Right.
that.
right.
About a few months ago, I heard a lecture about done by researchers up in Connecticut about the slaves that lived in Glastonbury, Connecticut. The the reason that they were particularly interested in Connecticut is that of all the New England states, Connecticut had the most slaves. Most of them were 2 or 3 slaves owned by business people who used them to help run their businesses. But the one comment that came through that was a surprise to me was that one of the ladies said that they followed one of the slaves and how we're talking revolutionary time period, that when he was released and became free, he became an indentured servant as a result. And they said that although there was this freedom that they had attained, their life actually had not improved, that an indentured servant's life was as bad as a slave, or vice versa. They were on that equally bad level. So it sounds like Cuff really came quite a bit above that to own land and to have some of the other things that he had. Certainly the examples they gave, none of them owned land, and they all continue to work for the same master. And the only difference was the title, indentured servant versus slave.
Well, if you were an indentured servant, your life was totally controlled by whoever held the indenture. Now, the big difference was that an indenture usually had an expiration date, so to speak, so that you could look forward to a certain date and time when you would be totally free if you were fortunate enough to survive that long.
Yeah.
Point is about indentured servitude in colonial Virginia. Most indentured servants did not live to see the end of their indenture.
Mhm.
Bruce,
Have you ever read anything about Thomas Gross? He was, to my knowledge, the only Black cabinet maker from colonial times. Obviously free. To be able to get a skill set like that was quite an accomplishment.
I haven't read about him.
Bruce, I have a question for you. You mentioned Sarah Frisby and you mentioned the Reynolds family. In your research, can you identify to which religious denomination they were affiliated with?
They were members of St. Anne's Church. They were Anglican and, of course, Episcopal. After the Declaration, after independence, the organization of the Protestant Episcopal Church in 1784. But they were connected with St. Anne's.
And the Sarah Frisby's ancestors, were they also Anglican?
Yes, they were.
Thank you.
Yeah, some of them were connected with St. Stephen's over in Earlville, Maryland.
Mhm.
Bruce, you probably don't want to give up any trade secrets, but I'm curious how you started going about the process of looking up Cuff's ancestry and what he attained in life. Could you kind of give us a little history of how you did that?
Well, I started with census records, and then I looked for the connection with the slave-owning Frisby families in Maryland. And like I said, in this case, I found out that Cuff Frisby had taken the surname of his previous owner, which did not always happen, which maybe did not happen more often than not. And I must add, there was a bit of perhaps good fortune there as well, that looking at the tax records, the census records, and the records of slave owners, the probate inventories and so forth, it was a long, tedious process, but just put things together one step at a time.
Well, and obviously you don't have all the records, and that's where you're making assumptions and educated guesses from all the various sources that you're putting together. So
Exactly. That's the fact that they didn't keep vital records on anybody back then. You have to go by family Bibles, church parish records, things like that. But obviously the records kept on slaves were, you mainly have to rely on probate inventories, which oftentimes listed slaves by name and age. You have to rely on manumission records, the records by which slaves were set free. So it is difficult. And the fact that I found that act of the Delaware General Assembly by which Cuff and the 4 other slaves of Sarah Frisby were transported from Maryland into Delaware. I found that when I was researching another matter. So I literally stumbled upon it.
Did you look at any rosters from the Revolutionary War?
No, we know that a sizable number of
Mhm.
Blacks did serve in the Army and in the Continental Army. I think the percentage was around 10 or something like that. But I did not look at those records. Of course, the generation in which Cuff became free was about a generation after the war
After that.
itself. But
Bruce, I have a question. Do you know where the property was located in Middletown?
no, I don't. It just said adjacent to another couple other property owners. I'd have to check my notes on that deed, but I can't tell you the exact location of the property. Yeah, I don't think it mentioned any street specifically.
Remind me, it was Reynolds who had sold him the property?
Yeah.
Was that it? I know that as of the late 1800s, which maybe doesn't help us at all, then the Reynolds owned the property that is just south of Cochran Square, like the south side, where the spa is now, on the south side of Cochran Square.
Okay.
So maybe it was around in there someplace.
Okay.
I was looking for the deed reference in my footnotes here. If you can give me just a second. I've got this paper completely out of order now. But, let's see.
While he's looking, let me just say that I have read anyway that sometimes people would manumit their slaves when they became Methodist, like that at the end of the 1700s and early 1800s, there was a big rise in Methodism, and that was,
Yeah, that's exactly right. That
lots of times.
the first generation of Methodists were really very much opposed to slavery, and the Methodist Church kind of backed off that anti-slavery stance after a generation or so. But early Methodists preached the equality of everyone in the eyes of God in terms of their need for faith in Christ. And well, they practiced what they preached, at least for that first generation. And I found the deed reference. It's Q3, volume Q3, page 188. And that's the Reynolds to Frisby deed.
Where would they have been buried? Any idea on that?
I don't know. We don't have any burial record of Cuff Frisby. The Delaware Archives in Dover has an enormous collection of tombstone records. It was done, I think, about 100 years ago, but it included only white cemeteries. It's called the Tatnall Tombstone Collection. And I think more recently there was a compilation of Kent County burial records, which included every cemetery in the county, but this is 100 years ago, and only the white cemeteries were inventoried by Tatnall and his fellow tombstone readers.
The Historical Society was just given a lot of those books by Louisa Zay. A lot of books that talk about tombstone records in various counties, including Cecil County, but also Kent County, Delaware, and Newcastle County. So we've got a lot more than we did before.
If we're talking about just tombstones, I'm sure there aren't that many Black tombstones because they couldn't afford a tombstone.
Exactly.
So the question then is, with his affiliation with St. Anne's, would it be possible that he would be buried at St. Anne's, just with an unmarked grave?
Or a section of the graveyard?
That's possible. I'd have to yield the floor to someone who's more familiar with the St. Anne's records than I am to answer that one.
I know that we have inquired about even cleaning the gravestones over there, but there's no water source anymore. So we can't even go over and biologically clean them to keep them preserved. Because there was a well at some point, but it was closed. And so now there's no running water, electricity, or anything.
That raises a question, like in general, for the Blacks who were associated with St. Anne's, if they were not buried in the St. Anne's cemetery, where would they have been?
I don't know. There is a, if you go inside the church, there is a balcony up there that was reserved for the slaves so that they could attend. But so that's a good question, whether there's a section in there. But like I said, I know there's supposed to be old records someplace of at least some of the gravestones. It's been said that there are Revolutionary War patriots in there that could include either slaves or whites, but I don't know.
Maybe.
What the reason that slaves were, so we actually think now that a large portion of the, for example, the Battle of Cooch's Bridge, that there were quite a few slaves that were part of that fought for the patriot cause. Partly because some of them were promised freedom if they fought, not always carried through, but they were promised that. But there were also a case where you eventually, it wasn't a draft, but you were told that you had to provide, each town had to provide a certain number of soldiers. And if they didn't want to go, they could pay somebody to go in their stead, or even pay an owner of a slave to send the slave. And that's how we ended up with a fair number of Black soldiers that were at the Battle of Cooch's Bridge and other battles throughout the war. There's a whole section in the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, that's actually dedicated to the genealogy of we call them forgotten patriots. That includes Blacks, Native Americans, and et cetera, that fought for the American cause. And so that there's actually a whole group dedicated just to their genealogy. And there's a book that was published several years ago that they've actually released. And if you read the Delaware section, I have a copy of that. We don't have many records of specifics, but we do know that they were part of the group that fought. Some states we have specific names. But if to carry through the rest of it, the Battle of Cuchus Bridge, the American side was led by General Maxwell. After the war, most of the generals took all their war records back home with them. There was no central place to store records. And so he took his back to, he lived in New Jersey, and he stored them in his barn. Well, what happened is the barn burnt down, so we don't have records of any of the soldiers that fought. And we think there's as many as 24 who died on the American cause, probably including Blacks, at the Battle of Cuchus Bridge. But the problem is that it was customary that the side that won was the one that was supposed to bury the dead. And they buried, what they did is the British in that case won, so they would have buried their dead as well as ours. But they didn't give shovels or tools like that to the soldiers, and they had to keep moving. So because the next battle was the Battle of Brandywine. So what they had to do instead was take whatever they had. They usually looked for ditches and things like that to throw the bodies in and then try to cover them. So we probably, there's a good chance we'll never find the grave site.
Well, thank you.
Bruce, I have another question for you. You mentioned the very few number of Blacks that owned property at that time. Do you think that Cuff would have, in addition to all of the other oppression and racism that he would have had to face, would have had to deal with some resentment because perhaps he was more well off than even a handful of whites at the time?
That's highly possible. There would have been resentment against him because his standing in the community was a bit higher than, well, there was a sizable percentage of white folks who did not own property. We think it was less than 50%, but Cuff Frisby was better off than many of those folks. And given the racist attitudes of the time, I'm sure that they might well have taken it out on him.
This is Kate O'Donnell speaking, and I'd like to say hello to my friend Anthony Johnson. Hi. And of course the Matsons, and apparently there's a Sarah O'Donnell on this. So there are three O'Donnells, who knew? I do have a question, and that is, did you uncover any evidence that Cuff was educated, and could he read and write?
The one document I saw, he signed his name with a mark or an X. So he was not literate.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think many of the women would have been either, no matter what.
Well, if there are no other questions, we want to thank Dr. Bendler for sharing with us this evening, but I don't want to cut anybody off if anyone else has a question. So last call for questions.
I'm willing to entertain any questions and make at least an honest effort to provide answers.
Okay. And if you all got the email, just a reminder that what was shared on the screen was attached to the email that I sent this morning. So if you are interested in seeing all of that, on your own piece of paper, that should be sent. If not, just reply to the Historical Society and we'll get that to you at mhistoricalsociety@gmail.com. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
You're welcome.
Appreciate. Okay. Well, we will see if we will have any kind of program in June. So keep your ear to the ground, and we will get back to you and let you all know what we have coming up. So Facebook, we're at Middletown Historical Society at Facebook, and we're trying to keep little things up there too to keep people apprised of what's going on. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're happy that you were able to come and join us for Dr. Bendler's discussion on Cuff Frisby. So have a good evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.